Hi, everyone. This is an episode on the follow-up of a comment made on my video rebutting Tovia Singer's claim that Zechariah 13:6 proves Jesus is a false prophet because it's a prophecy allegedly about someone who has an injury in his hands, and he's a false prophet in Zechariah 13:6. And he exploits the fact that the Jews for Jesus and other messianic groups are use an argument that this Jesus was prophesied in Zechariah, and they use this verse and they don't look at the context, and it's a false prophet. And so they're trying to say, see, Jesus was prophesied because he has nails in his hands and so on, and they blow up, and he loves it. It's just shows you have to read context. And you'll make a big mistake. So he took advantage of that, and we went through that in our episode on that. But then MTalk wrote me back about Zechariah 13:7, and she says that's proof Jesus is a false prophet because there Jesus actually quotes the passage and says it applies to himself. And in context, it is about a false prophet. But what is Jesus doing? Is he quoting it as a figure of speech, which is what is the answer? But we'll go through this one step at a time. So in case anybody else brings this up, you'll be prepared to state what's the correct explanation. You'll see why it does explain the passage. All right, just to remind you, this is how it all started. Zechariah 13:6. Tovia Singer says, Zechariah 13:6 is about Jesus. And one shall say to him, what are these wounds between your hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. That doesn't even make sense for Jesus, who was not wounded in the house of his friends, but in the house of his enemies. And also, what he's really doing is, in context, it's about a false prophet. And he then tells the story that the evangelists for Jesus, who are Christians, use this to prove that Jesus is prophesied in the Jewish Bible. And this is the video he did. And he actually calls it Shocker. Jewish Bible predicted Jesus was a false prophet, July 7, 2022. But is it really that? Tovia Singer claimed that the word. Some people try to say there's the word back, and that instead of it's in his hands, it's in his back, and I'll show you why in a second. And he says that's due to their nervousness about the fact it's pointing at Jesus. Otherwise, so it's just some invalid effort to evade this truth. Well, I'm sorry, but the Israel Bible, which is a totally Jewish Bible, says the same thing. So it says, and if he is asked, what are those sores on your back? And he will reply, from being beaten in the homes of my friends. So even the Jewish Bible has it. So it has nothing to do with anybody being worried about Jesus being the one who's envisioned here, in specifically being prophesied about. And he's a false prophet because he is somebody who gets injured in his hands. So it's not true. And I just want to play this, a small clip. And Tim Buckley did a great job. And this was 4 years before Tovia Singer did what he did. And I think that when we do videos online, I think maybe we should sometimes search the name Zechariah 13:6, if that's our video, and see what Christians have said. Just a word to the wise to Tovia Singer. But anyway, let's just see. He had the answer then, 4 years before Tovia put up his video. So here we go.
But let's move on, because in verse 6 we get to the passage where people do find Jesus. And if anyone asks them, what are these wounds on your chest? The answer will be, the wounds I received in the house of my friends. Oh, doesn't quite work, does it, in the RSV? Wounds in my chest doesn't quite sound so much like Jesus. So what's going on? What's going on is that the King James Version has translated not between, but in your hands. Now, the problem here is a preposition. Prepositions are always a problem for translators. They never work the same in two different languages. And here, the preposition that the King James had rendered in thine hands, is rendered by modern translations in the way in which it's more usually rendered into English in the Bible, between. Between your hands, what does that mean? And translators usually guess chest, but some of them guess back. And so it becomes, what are these wounds in your chest, or what are these wounds in your back? And that's where our riddle comes in. Because if you do read the King James and you read wounds in your hands, then you're tempted to think of Jesus, because the words sound similar.
And I put that video up there so that you would see that Tovia Singer does have some defense, which is that this man himself is trying to rebut Christians who use this passage to say, I found Jesus in Zechariah, and they don't look at the context. And he's trying to educate Christians who make that argument. You're destroying Christ because this is a false prophet. So Tovia is not wrong. He's exploiting the situation, obviously, to his advantage. And so that's why good every one of us needs critics to come along and show if we're being fast and loose, or we're getting overzealous in an argument, and we've got to always keep our arguments subdued and go by the facts and not try to make stuff where it doesn't really apply. Anyway, let me now show you what happened. So after this whole thing happened, this person writes me back. I don't know if it's a man or a woman. I think it may be a woman. I don't know. MTalk 828. And it says this about the response I made. Thank you for your analysis. But wait a second. Rabbi Tovia Singer is onto something here that convinces me that the false shepherd or prophet is indeed Jesus. You didn't address that the passage in Zechariah is talking about Jesus because Jesus said so himself. Yes, he did. And the Gospel of Mark, it says, quote, then Jesus said to them, his disciples, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. He was quoting Zechariah 13:7, and she's correct. So it is clear Jesus associated himself with a false shepherd of Zechariah 13. This is clear as day. Kind regards. So she thinks she's demolished Jesus Christ. Well, let's just take a look a little bit further. So a very good, somebody asked this question on Stack Exchange, Christian Stack Exchange, and David D responded on December 15, 2022. So this was very recent. And he writes back to this person, you're correct. That's what it says. The Zechariah passage talks about the killing of false leaders, the shepherd, and the scattering of the followers, the sheep. Jesus is using the principle of sheep scattering when the shepherd is killed, followers scatter when the leader is killed, to illustrate the situation that is about to happen with him and his disciples. It is a figure of speech taken from scripture that Jesus' listeners would have been familiar with. Jesus is not identifying himself with the false leaders of Zechariah's day, something like when Jesus says, quote, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 12, verse 40. It continues, Jesus using the story of Jonah, who was a rebellious, hard-hearted prophet, and the fact that Jonah was in a dark place for 3 days and 3 nights, just like Jesus would be in a dark place for 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus is not identifying himself with Jonah. So that's absolutely common sense. I mean, figures of speech or common phrases don't mean you're saying you have anything else to do with that context. So that's something we need to know. You can quote something out of context when you're not trying to bring that context in. You're not saying that. If you said, I'm going to prove to you I'm a Messiah because here's the passage about a Messiah, and then I quote it, but it's not. It's about an anti-Messiah, let's say. Well, then I quoted it for the purpose of proving it applied to me. But if I'm simply using it as a figure of speech, I'm using it just to use a phrase that people are familiar with, and the concept. You strike the shepherd, the sheep scatter. It would be a normal thing that happens whether it's a good shepherd, it's a bad shepherd. It always will happen. And likewise with Jonah, 3 nights and 3 days in the belly of a whale is a figure of speech for Jesus, the way he's using it to analogize to his burial and resurrection. But in Jonah's case, it was actually literal. But he was he wasn't a false prophet, but he was a rebellious prophet running away from God. And Jesus wasn't that. So Jesus wasn't quoting it saying, I'm like Jonah, in the sense I'm like Jonah's disobedience. So that's what is the point. Jesus wasn't quoting Jonah for that purpose. And so if he did, the context it would have to be applying that to himself. But if he's just quoting that figure of speech, it doesn't make it that he is now a rebellious prophet. See, so that's something people have to know. It's called logic and speech, and you have to know how people can use figures of speech that are directly out of context. They don't have to be in context. They just have their own meaning, but the phrase is familiar and people like to hear familiar phrases. All right, everybody. God bless. I hope that helps everybody. And I'm going to send a link to this video to this lady or man or I don't know, MTalk 828. So I hope that helped you and answered your question. God bless. Take care. Ciao.